and devastate things. So this is the idea. The writer is using this tool of language to get us to understand. It says, then it was impossible to count them or their camels. All right, so we're getting an idea of this vast array of people that are coming in. They're taking what's not theirs. They're plundering this country. They're treating them harshly, so much so that the Israelites retreat to digging out their own shelters in the clefts and the mountains and trying to get away, trying to be safe. Now, this is all in response to what? Disobedience, okay. Initially, they didn't clear the land like God asked them to. Look, when he left that direction with Joshua, and Joshua left it with the people, they did not clear the land. But this is also in response to something else. What?
Doing evil in the sight of the Lord?
Doing evil in the sight of the Lord. Okay? So this isn't just this random series of events where Israel's clicking along good, and then all of a sudden this warring people come in. This is a direct result of their abandonment of their faith in God and their pursuit of evil. All right? It literally says, for 7 years, the Lord gave them into the hands of the Midianites. The Lord gave them over. The Lord allowed the Midianites to swoop in and be this oppressor on them. Once again, just like happened preceding Deborah. So you're beginning to see this cycle, right? The judge comes out, the judge frees them, Deborah frees them, she leads them for a season, she passes away, whoop, slippity slip, there they go, right back into the evil things. This for us, and anytime I read this, I begin to think, oh my, Lord, guard my heart, right? I don't want to walk with you in a way that if a leader that I served under leaves and goes to another place, or I move to a different town and I don't feel like I have that strong of a church anymore, or something like that, I don't want that to be the director and the dictator of my faith. I want to have a valid, vibrant faith with God no matter what's going on around me. There's no personal element to their faith. It's dependent on the leader, just like it was with Joshua, and then it was with Deborah and the other preceding judges, and then as soon as they departed, whoop, off they go right back into their old ways. There's no personal accountability for their faith. So that's something we need to take note of in our own personal lives. Now let's go ahead and skip down. I want to highlight something here in verse 11. Somebody read verse 11 and 12. We're going to begin to get a picture here of Gideon.
The angel of the Lord came and sat down under the oak in Ophrah that belonged to Joshua, at where his son Gideon was threshing wheat in a winepress to keep it from the Midianites. When the angel of the Lord appeared to Gideon, he said, "Lord is with you, mighty warrior." All
right, there's a couple things we want to take note of here. Again, apart from digging their homes in clefts and rocks and mountains and hiding out that way, we see another picture of the oppression of the Midianites. What's that picture we see here?
Hiding. They were hiding. He was threshing this grapes or whatever in hiding because they would have taken it.
Correct. Okay. Now, why is it so unique that it's named here the winepress, that he's threshing the grain or the wheat in the winepress? Why is that unique?
Wow, I don't know.
Because that wasn't the place you did it. There was a specific place called the threshing floor. And it was kind of like an open door, kind of like a covered structure with no walls, so that the wind could come through. Okay? So when you're threshing wheat, they would crush the wheat and the stalk and the chaff and all of that stuff. And then they would take their pitchforks and they toss it up into the air. And since the wheat, the good part, was heavier than all of the other part, the seed would fall back to the ground and the chaff and the refuse parts would blow off to the side. So that's how they would separate it on the threshing floor. That was called threshing. That's how they separated it in that day. So it would be unusual for them to be doing this in the wine press. The place where they're literally smashing grapes and compiling, barrels of wine and jars of, that wouldn't be there. So this gives us another visual, another point of the veracity of the Midianites. That they can't even do their normal processes out in the normal places because the Midianites are coming with this oppression. But this is ended with a very unique description of Gideon. What is that description?
Mighty warrior.
Mighty warrior. Can you imagine that? Here's Gideon hiding out from the Midianites, threshing wheat with a pitchfork, just trying not to get noticed. An angel shows up and says, "How's it going, mighty warrior?" That is the complete opposite of what you think would happen. You'd think that this mighty celestial being would be like, "What's going on, hideouter?" No, he actually calls him mighty warrior. Why is it that he calls him mighty warrior? Anybody?
That's the way he saw him in the future.
Okay, that's the way he saw him in the future. All right? Anybody else?
I think there's a kind of an aspect of like speaking life over it, because later on you go on to learn that Gideon thinks of himself as the least among the least, like his tribe is the least among his clan, and he's the least of his entire tribe, and he's like, I'm a nobody. And so it's kind of this idea that the angel is speaking something that is probably not true. Gideon's probably not a great warrior, but he's speaking something that he sees and that he's trying to call out in his life.
Gideon might be a great warrior. He hasn't been tested. Right?
He's not denying that he's a warrior. He's endowed this work is with them.
Right. Mighty warrior, the Lord is with you. Right? So the mighty warrior it's not necessarily because of anything innate within Gideon's makeup, but more his heart to be obedient, to walk with God as God leads, because we'll see that God actually brings the victory. Right? It's not actually Gideon. Gideon's obedient, but it's God who does the work. Right? Just like Deborah and Barak. They were obedient. They walked into it, following what God said. And here, so I think it's a combination. He's a mighty warrior because of what God is, because who God is. But at the same time, the Lord doesn't see him as this weakling, the least of the least. The Lord has a purpose for him. Otherwise, he wouldn't have shown up there. So the Lord is looking down the road going, look, I have a plan for you. You're not the weakest of the weak. I'm calling you out to do something, and you're going to accomplish it because the Lord is with you. So that, for me, changes the concept of what a mighty warrior is. So I start thinking about a mighty warrior because now we start to think of this in terms of spiritual life. Am I a mighty warrior because I can do anything in my own strength? No. Are you a mighty warrior because you can do anything? No. But if we walk with God, we can experience the victory in battles. We can begin to see the hand of God move as we're obedient, as we trust him. We can see him deliver. We can see him bring provision. We can see him lead and guide through dynamic purpose. Not because of anything that we are, but because of everything he is. So I start to think about that as I look through this. Think about walking with the Lord like Gideon does here. Now, it takes a little bit for Gideon to come around the corner. I can identify with that. Right? He immediately makes the excuse he's the least of the least. And then he does a couple things here. All right? Before he begins to ask for these things, God's response, Peter, in verse 15, he says, "Pardon me, my Lord," Gideon replied, "but how can I save Israel? My clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and I am the least in my family." And here's the Lord's response. The Lord answered, "I will be with you." That is an indication that all he's asking for Gideon to do is trust him, to go with him. And that is where the Lord steps in, and the Lord enables him to be the tool that strikes down the Midianites. It is the Lord that does the work. So make no mistake, he is a mighty warrior because of God, not apart from God. You and I are mighty warriors because of God, not apart from God. And obviously you recognize I'm not speaking of physical warfare in this case. I'm speaking of our spiritual battles and our spiritual walk. Now, here's one of the first things that I connect with here. I'm one of these people that there are times in my life I want that sign of confirmation. Is anybody else like that? You're like, okay, God, listen. You didn't appear to me in an angel under the oak tree while I was threshing wheat in the wine press. All right? You just placed this voice in my heart that I think this is where I got to go. So if it's really you, you know, I've been there. I'm like, please, God, let somebody else confirm this. Like, some way. So I can identify with Gideon in verse 17. He says, if now I have found favor in your eyes, give me a sign that it is really you talking to me. Boy, I am so glad there are people in the Bible like me. Because it really gives me hope, right? Well, yeah.
Well, they came first.
They came first, but I can identify with them. Like, that's what I mean, right? Now, the Lord goes on here to do this incredible thing, right? How does God confirm that He is the Lord? Has anybody read that from memory?
How he confirms, he puts out the police.
Not yet.
Oh.
We're not there yet.
I don't know that. I don't know what you're talking about.
He consumes the offering.
So, exactly. So, Gideon says, wait here. I'm going to go prepare a meal, an offering. And the Lord tells him, I'll wait for you to get back. And so he comes back with meat and bread and all this, and he puts it on a rock, right? And the angel of the Lord takes his staff and he touches the rock. And fire comes out of the rock and consumes that offering.
That's a sign.
And that's when, yeah, you said it. And that's when Gideon's like, my eyes have seen the servant of the Lord. Like, he's blown away in this moment. God has, what's the word I'm looking for? I almost said convinced, but confirmed. Right? The Lord has confirmed it through this incredible sign as He consumes this with fire out of the rock. Now, Gideon is now beginning to go, okay, God, you're really talking to me. You're calling me into something here. There's an interesting piece here that God calls Gideon to do before the battle. Gideon is called by the Lord to go to his father's house and tear down the altar to Baal and the Asherah pole that was right next to it, and to slaughter the second bull from his father's herd and sacrifice it upon that altar to the Lord. So this is interesting here because in Gideon's own family, there's an altar to Baal and Asherah. We're starting to get an image here, again, of how immersive the rebellion was in the land of Israel. That even Gideon's father, the one God is calling to be the instrument He'll use to lead them out of the Midianites' oppression, his father's house has an altar to Baal and Asherah right next to it. It's right there in his hometown, right there, that intimate to him. And the Lord asks him to go and tear it down. Now there's something here that again starts to show a little bit of Gideon's character. In verse 27, it says, so Gideon took 10 of his servants and did as the Lord told him. But because he was afraid of his family and the townspeople, he did it at night rather than in the daytime. So we see this interesting portrait of Gideon starting to emerge, right? I'm the least of the least. Who am I that you would call me? would you give me a sign that you're actually the Lord calling me to do this? And then when he does, in fact, obey the Lord for the first event, he does so in a way that nobody notices him. I really feel like this is steps in growth in Gideon's life. But I can identify with that, right? It's like, the Lord wants me to go talk to my neighbor, but I'm going to give him a track instead. Right? I'm going to slip this track, I'm going to put it under his windshield wiper, right? And I've been obedient, right? I shared it with him. I don't know, can you identify with Gideon in this? He's trying, he's working at it, but isn't it interesting that this is who God chose as the judge? I'm so glad that God doesn't choose the perfect people all the time to be the ones that he uses. He chooses those whose hearts are right before him. He chooses those who are willing to obey. He chooses those who are willing to be in a place that he can be they can be used. All right. So now let's get into the second half as we're leading up to the battle. In verse 36 and 36 to 38, let's go ahead and read that if somebody has that.
Gideon said to God, "If you will save Israel by my hand, as you had promised, look, I will place a wool fleece on the threshing floor. If there is a dew only on the fleece and all the ground is dry, then I will know that you will save Israel by my hand, as you said." And that is what happened. Gideon rose early the next day. He squeezed the fleece and wrung out the dew, a bowl full of water.
All right. So this is the famous confirmation story, right? Sign that Sue was talking about earlier. Now this is near and dear to my heart because this goes all the way back in my life to the message my youth pastor preached when I was 12-year-old in youth group, and he encouraged us not to be afraid to ask the Lord for a sign, right? And so it was that day that I prayed at an altar for a sign of when I would meet the woman that God had for me, and it was in relation to this encouragement to ask the Lord to confirm something in my life. Now let me ask you this question. Do you think God is put off by our invitation for a confirmation?
No.
Do you think that illustrates a lack of faith to God?
I do.
Okay. Let's talk about it.
I think it's okay.
You think it's okay, even though it might reveal some shaky trepidation in faith, right? It might not actually be a complete lack of faith, but there's this like count me to 3, here we go, you know? Okay?
I think sometimes we're afraid of his answers, even though we know he's a loving God who's just and at the same time merciful, and at the same time he can be angry. He's everything.
Well, we see that, right? We see the respect from Gideon at the beginning of verse 39 when he says, "Do not be angry with me, let me make just one more request." So we see there is a respectful approach here to the servant of the Lord as Gideon is making his request. Now, I think, let's talk some more about this. So if you think it's a lack of faith, why do you think God honors it? Let's talk about that.
Well, it's faith that you're doing it. You're not just dismissing it.
Okay.
And really now, what if he was wrong? I mean, we could be wrong.
What if who was wrong?
Like Gideon, what if he misinterpreted? I mean, sometimes people misinterpret it. They think God is talking and he's not. So I think it's a good thing.
Okay. So for you see it, even if it's a shaky or a partial lack of faith here, but it's a process in Gideon where he's becoming familiar that later on when God's asking him to do some other things, he's not asking for the sign anymore.
Right.
Okay?
But for now.
Okay, anybody else?
I would say based off of like that definition, then it's not so much a lack of faith in God, but in ourselves. So like a lack of faith in ourselves of actually understanding what the Lord's voice sounds like.
That's good. And I will tell you, the days in my life, not that I've achieved anything, but I remember those conversations and those kind of prayers happened a lot earlier in my walk with God. And as the years have gone along and I've become more familiar with the leading of God in my life, my invitation for those confirmations has waned. I've not become so dependent on that because why? Because now I have more confidence, not that I needed more confidence in God, but more confidence in my ability to discern God's voice. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, anybody else?
Can I ask you a question?
Go for it.
Does Gideon know what he's supposed to do?
At this point, it's not specific. He knows that he's going to be used to free the people of Israel from the Midianites and the Amalekites. He knows that God is going to leave it in that, but he is not sure about the process yet. Like, God has not taken him to the water and told him he has too many men and he has to sort them down to 300 and then tell him take his servant and go down and listen to the camp that comes later, and they hear the one talking about the dream and then the jars and the torches and all that stuff. None of that stuff.
I was thinking more in the abstract, like, does he know he's supposed to be obedient? Because if you're supposed to be obedient and you're only going to go halfway, no. I mean, God is strong and we are weak.
Yeah.
But, and so he can still, work, he can still do what he needs to do.
Sure.
But what he wants us to be sold out.
I agree. He does. And I don't think Gideon would have ended up in the place he was if he didn't have a faith and a trust in being willing to be obedient to God. The ironic thing is God does choose people who have an element of faith in this rebellious nation, right? So he is choosing somebody here who may not on the surface understand that this is God right off the bat, but there is still some drawing to the presence of the Lord, and in that faith they've stood up and responded, just like Deborah.
Or like Mary.
I'm sorry?
Just like Mary.
Just like Mary. And what's interesting, though, is when you think about another famous woman, right, in the Bible that has a song, it's Mary, right, and Miriam and other ones. But when you're thinking about a Christological jump from Judges to Christ, and you think about Deborah, many of the Hebrew scholars began to refer to Deborah as the mother of Israel because of her faith, her prophetic leading, because of her character, all of that stuff. She is held high in regard in the annals of Hebrew history. And so when I was reading through that, I began to think the same thing. I'm like, hey, this reminds me of another woman who seemed like they were going out on a limb. They were being used by God when in all other cases it seemed like they were forgotten. But here God has set this one aside and used Mary to be the conduit through which the greatest Savior and freer of Israel will come. So that is interesting you said that, right? But yes, Mary kind of in that same boat. Like, okay, here I am, your humble servant, use me.
And she did it when she was betrothed to Joseph, and back then, you could easily get stoned for what you did.
Well, that's when you look at the character of Joseph, right? I know we're rabbit trailing here, but you look at the character of Joseph and you're thankful for a godly man that protected her and believed what was happening in faith, instead of ousting her and having some giant public event. No. Joseph acted in faith just as powerfully. Okay? All right, so let's bring it back to Gideon. So I do think Gideon did have within him some understanding that he needed to obey, but he wasn't sure what it was. Now, I think him going and tearing down the altar to Baal and the Asherah pole was kind of a precursor to what was about to happen. I don't think it was just God trying to send a message to that town and to his family. I think it was also an opportunity for Gideon to step in and say, I'll go, I'll do it. And he did. And so then, of course, Gideon comes back with the fleeces. All right?
The cynic could say, well, God never said, don't do it at night.
Correct. Yeah, because, so as a leader, that's something you learn pretty quick. If you want it done a certain way, tell them the certain way from the beginning, or you just have to trust them to get to the end result the way they choose.
Yeah.
And that may have been exactly what it was. It didn't say he had to do it in broad daylight, so he may have been acting in some wisdom there, right? Because what happens, we skipped over it, but what happens is the townspeople come out the next day and they're like, who did this? Bring them out, they need to die, right? But interestingly enough, I skipped over this, but Joash, who is Gideon's dad, he tells the hostile crowd, Scripture tells him, are you going to plead Baal's cause? Are you trying to save him? I think that's a hilarious response. Like, you believe in this God, and somebody tore down this one altar in this vast country, and are you trying to plead this God's cause? Is he alive and capable of doing it himself? It was kind of an interesting thing, but it reminded me of somebody from the New Testament. Anybody?
Samson?
No, New Testament. And this may not be pertinent at all to the story. It just reminded me of somebody else who made a similar plea.
Paul?
No? It was, I just lost his name. He was the part of the Sanhedrin, right? And when, after the day of Pentecost, and they were brought in before the Sanhedrin, it's not Nicodemus, doggone. He trained Paul. I can't think of his name.
Galeas or something, I just read that. I can't pronounce the name.
But he said, look, if this is from the Lord, nobody can stop it. But if it's not, it's going to die out. Right? So there was wise counsel given there, and it kind of sounded, to me, it just reminded me of that same counsel. Like, hey, if this is really the Lord doing all this work, no matter what you do, you can't stop it, right?
Right.
And so this is kind of the same thing in reverse that he's saying to these people, and it tones them down, and Gideon proceeds forward. All right? So,
Don't kill him.
huh?
Gamaliel?
Gamaliel. Thank
Yeah,
you.
that's what I was.
Gamaliel.
I looked it up.
You didn't have to tell everybody that. Okay, so one fleece is out of the way, which is dynamic, by the way. I mean, total work of God. That the fleece is totally full of water and the ground is dry. Rains out a full bowl of water. By the way, that's a lot of dew.
Yeah.
Right? A whole bowl. Must have been a giant fleece, right? But then, ironically enough, the Lord answers, and he does it again. Okay, one more time. Just, now do it in reverse. Now make all the ground wet and the fleece dry. And sure enough, the Lord confirms. And Gideon is all in at this point. Here I am. I'm yours. Let's go. So, Gideon moves forward in obedience. But what does this apply to our lives when we think about our journey of faith, our wrestlings with God, the moments when God invites us into something and we hesitate for a moment, or maybe we're searching in discernment to whether that's our voice or his, or maybe we do it differently than somebody else might have done it. What do we learn here from the character of Gideon? There's a purpose in the writing.
That it's okay to put out a fleece.
It's okay to put out a fleece, right? God doesn't seem deterred by Gideon's request, right? God doesn't seem moved by those moments of indecision or our lack of discernment. In fact, I think it actually speaks more highly to the fact that we genuinely want to know rather than assume. Right? In my life, when I think about how I approach the Lord, if there's ever a chance that I can get that definite, there is no doubt, black and white word, I'm all in. And if it takes a week of fasting and prayer. Maybe I have this inkling at the beginning, but I go into that prayer time and I just grab a hold and I hang on. I don't think God's going, look, you already kind of had an inkling at the beginning of the week. What are you wasting your time here for? I think God's pleased that I set my face in His direction and I set my heart to understand.
Does this contrast with Abraham and Isaac, that story? Because when Abraham took Isaac to the mountain, at the very moment that he was going to kill his son, God, at the very moment, stopped him from doing it. And his faith to take him to the mountain, caught completely floored with the fact that he couldn't understand why God was telling him to go to the mountain and kill his son. It takes courage. It takes a lot of courage to follow the Lord.
I would have questioned that one.
I don't think it's in contrast. I think this is a different person, a different scenario, and it's a different outflow of the faith in Gideon's life than it was. And of course, Abraham is considered the father of faith, right?
Yeah.
And he's listed, obviously, in the Hall of Heroes in Hebrews. But in Gideon's scenario, you're right, courage, it takes incredible courage. And as you move through the rest of the story of Gideon and conquering the Midianites, guys, for the troops to show up and God say to Gideon, there's too many. Why did God say there was too many?
To give the glory unto God.
That's right, because Israel would have taken the glory. Again, this word is in there for a specific purpose, for us to understand the leaning of the heart of Israel. And I think when we come in weakness and brokenness before the Lord, there's no shot we could ever take that glory from Him. We recognize our inability to do the things God is asking us to do. And when we stand in faith, however weak our legs may be, however many fleeces we might have to lay out, we eventually stand shaking in the moment. We're still standing in obedience. And there's no shot that we can take that glory. It's all for Him. Right? So God dwindles the army down. Did you have something? Oh, I thought I heard somebody go, like they were going to say something.
I think God is happy and pleased when we have the courage to respond to what He's doing. And it's kind of like, okay, if we step out in faith and make the first move, or make a move at all, we see the result of His hand moving. So I'm not saying God is limited. I'm not saying He's dependent on us, perhaps. I'm saying that it takes faith on our part to make an effort to move forward. If we don't do that, then no wonder we're not seeing what He's doing. And we miss out so many times. But faith,
Oh, it's okay.
finally, we get to see His glory in everything when we choose to step out in faith.
That's right. And really what we see here in Gideon, we see him wrestling, not necessarily with his faith, because if he didn't have faith, would he even continue to be wrestling with the direction?
Yeah.
Right? He's wrestling with direction. He's wrestling with what is my task. Are you actually asking me, the weakest, to step out front and lead this thing? And I think it's actually a testament to his faith that he's even wrestling with the specifics for me, right? If I had no faith, I wouldn't even be spending my time in that moment.
I guess I had a question on this whole, testing the Lord. There are other spots in the Bible where it says, do not put the Lord your God to the test. And now those are a little bit different because it's talking about when the Israelites were at the water and they were like, we're thirsty, we're just going to go back to Egypt. And then He's like, don't test me because I'm going to lay it on you. Or in the other time when Jesus is quoting that to Satan because Satan is asking Him to test God by jumping off the tall thing. But, so there are those times where it says, do not test the Lord your God. But I guess the kind of the contrast here that I'm seeing is in the story right before this, Barak kind of tests the Lord as well. Like, he's like, I'm going to go do that, but Deborah, you have to come with me. And then Barak actually gets punished, or like kind of disciplined for that, because you don't have the faith that you should. Why are you adding on this addendum to what God has asked you to do? When Gideon, it seems like Gideon's also adding addendums of like, I'll go do that, but prove yourself with this fleece first. Like, so how is this different, I guess, in your mind between Barak and Gideon?
Well, I would say, to begin with, I don't read the Barak story that way.
Okay.
Right? It's hard for us because we want to read tone into something that may not be there. Right? We want to read Deborah's response as, well, you know, Barak, if I go with you, you're not getting the glory for this. Like, you want to read it as a chide from Deborah, right? It may not, in fact, be that. For me, if there's a person that's leading the nation as a prophetess, hearing from the voice of God, why wouldn't I want them to go with me? Why would? So for me, I look at it from an angle that Barak's going, look, I recognize you're telling me to go, but by golly, I want you there with me. You're the leader that she doesn't have to stand in the battle, and it doesn't say she does, but she accompanies them. For me, let's have the presence of God accompany us, right? Let's have the presence of God speak to us in clarity and confirmation, especially if it's a big deal in our life. Let's use our faith and entreat the Lord and test Him in that good way, right?
We talked about it a little bit at the end of last week, because the other part of it, I agree with you on that, because then they sing that song together.
That's right.
It's not like Barak goes away and sulks or feels
Right.
like he can get to participate in the victory. Him and Deborah sing a song of victory together. So he's, I think, perfectly happy with the way things played out, because he believes that, you know, we even use the example of Moses saying to God, you know,
I'm not going from here. Yep. Because God told them to get up and depart, and Moses said, we're not leaving without your presence. How else will everyone in this world know that we're your people unless your presence goes with us? But nobody chides Moses for saying to God, I'm not leaving without you. So it's an interesting progression here that's happening.
I'm just thinking about how, you know, we talked about the devil testing, you know, or wanting to test God by jumping off, you know, but that's not what Gideon was doing. He wasn't like, okay, I'm going to jump off this mountain now, you got to catch me, I'm testing you. I'm laying the fleece before the Lord. Like, so I don't feel like it's a testing in the same way.
Right. And when you think about... It's more of a sign, not a testing, because the testing that God is more often than not referencing is the mindset of the Israelites. If this was really against God's ways, He would stop us. I'm testing God's limits here.
But I still hear you saying that God's going to be happy with less than a whole effort.
Say that again?
I still hear you saying that God's going to be happy with less than a whole effort.
Oh, less than a whole effort. Okay.
Because, I mean, if we're supposed to be all gung-ho, we're supposed to be 100% faith.
Agreed.
And we say, make my hat turn white.
Yeah.
You know, that's not the whole thing.
Yeah, but we're still working on our faith, like the man in the New Testament said, I have faith, but help my unbelief. So, you know, it goes in steps. I don't know how you can increase your faith. So maybe he's just not there yet. You don't have to be at the top right now. I mean, you start somewhere and then you go up.
Yeah, I was thinking that too. Where I would concede on that is that, let's say that you owe someone $10, but all you have is $6, and you really wish that you could give the 10, but you give them the 6.
Right, he's giving what he has.
Yes.
Okay.
That would be good.
Now I think that to give more than we have is unrealistic. Right? So to respond, so it's what you just described as the widow's mite, where Jesus turned and said, you guys are all giving out of your surplus. She's giving out of her need. She's giving everything she has. For Gideon here, This may be the top end of his faith at this point.
Amen, exactly.
All right? Considering that his family's home resides right next to an altar to Baal and Asherah. For him to even be walking to this point, it may already be at the top end of his faith, and he's already leading out in the obedience by inquiring for a sign.
That's a good point.
Right? Also keep in mind that many of those other gods that they served in the Mesopotamian culture, they depended on for very specific signs. They would worship for rain for the crops. They would worship for fertility. They would worship for this and that. And if it stopped, it meant their worship was not right. Or they needed to up their sacrifice or whatever. So you also have to keep in mind that Gideon's been raised in this culture where they see all of this other world approach to the gods. And now an angel from heaven appears and he's proceeding forward with the best understanding he has. Whatever shaky faith he might have in Jehovah is present enough for him to go, okay, now do this, now let's go. Let's move from this point. And I think we all reach that point at some point in our life. That is the top end of our faith at some point. So that's a great question, Kevin, because these are things we wrestle with. But I don't think in any way this version of asking of God for discernment and for confirmation is a sign that we don't trust God. I think it's coming back to this idea that we don't trust our judgment. Right?
Right.
And so this is helping us sort through the walk of faith in our life. So that's a great piece that we can take away from here, because if we, as Spirit-filled people, right, we believe that the Spirit of God has come, and now instead of depending on an angel to appear under the tree in our front yard to give us direction, we believe that the Holy Spirit comes and ministers direction and power and drops the direction within us. And now we walk in obedience in according to his leading. So this is vital for us to be able to wrestle with that faith and that discernment within us so that we can be obedient and be used of God. However great or small the task may be, whether it be at night or in the middle of the day. Or, here, just think about how the rest of that battle went, right? The Lord asked some very interesting things of Gideon. Get rid of all your soldiers. You're only taking 300. Well, golly, if he hadn't confirmed to Gideon just before that with such definitive results, I'm not quite sure Gideon would have been like, what? We're going against this army that was just described as a swarm of locusts that covers the ground. You can't even count them. And you want me to get rid of all of them and only take 300? So I think there is a definitive process here that the Lord is allowing Gideon to walk through to bring him into the place that God uses most mightily. And then, hey, he gets up in the middle of the night and God says, go down next to the camp. What? The judge, the leader of the army, he says, yeah, sneak down next to that tent and just sit there and listen. Nobody in their right mind is doing that. But Gideon does. Why? Because he's in the mind of the Lord. He's following the leading of God. And it's there that he hears the confirmation of God's plan from the enemy. In the vision of the barley loaf rolling down and wiping them out. So he goes back and he gives them the directions of the jars and the torches and all of that, and they go surround it, and then the Lord allows chaos to descend on them as they're breaking their jars and hollering, and they say, we're surrounded, and then they just all begin to fight each other. God doesn't even let the 300 work right then. He just, you want to talk about the 300, right? Forget about the Spartans. Let's talk about this 300, right? The Battle of Thermopylae. This is the Battle of the Midianites. No, anyway. So I think there's a progression. I think at some point in our walk with God, we do need these moments at the top end of our faith. We do need God to confirm some things as we learn, as we hear, as we confirm within our discernment. And then God can ask more of us. And we're like, yeah, that's God. That sure is God. But it comes down to where our focus is. Where's our attention? Where's our obedience? Because we'll never get there if those three things aren't pointed at the Lord. Right? and our faithfulness has to be there. We can't be building altars to Baal and Asherah next to our house and playing around with that and expect to be able to walk with God at the same time. That's a difficult thing. All right? Any last thoughts as we wrap up?
Yeah, I'm just kind of thinking from the point that he's like a leader, and he's summoning people, going to the battle. And this is good thing to doubt. Lord, are you going to? What if I'm going with these people and saying, Lord is gonna be with us, and you are not? What then?
That's good. That's good.
This is probably he's wrestling with, making sure that Lord is with them for sure, gonna
Yes.
bring a victory.
That's a great point, Peter, because that's something that I've said in my own life as I've matured in my walk with God. I've been very careful of using the phrase, the Lord said.
Yeah.
Because I better be 1,000% sure that that's the Lord if I'm going to say that. Because I never want to stand before the Lord one day and have him go, well, you put a lot of words in my mouth. And you led some people sideways by using that tag that I wasn't actually saying. So as a leader or a person trying to be obedient to the presence of God, if we're going to say what God is saying, we better be sure God is saying it. Because, by golly, we're going to stand before the throne someday, and we're going to give an account for every word, for every deed. And I'm with you, Peter. It's no light task to wear that burden and to stand before people and say, this is the direction we have to go. I've heard from God. This is where we're going. And to not have the conviction to know that you know that's where you're going, you'll always lead in a shaky manner. Whether that's your home, whether that's in a business, whether that's in a family, whether that's in a church. As a leader, once that conviction hits, this is it, now you pick up your bags and you're ready to go. That's important. Good point, Peter. Anybody else?
I guess the last thing is I've always liked the kind of parallel between Gideon's story here and Abraham's story when he defeated all the kings of Babylon because they both defeated the people with 300 men, and they both attacked in the middle of the night, and it was both in the north of Israel, like within, within 50 miles of each other, that this battle took place. So it's just like, God is repeating to the Israelites, like, look, I did it with Abraham, I can do it with Gideon, like, just trust me. And then, they still don't get it.
And I find it interesting that God seems to, here at the beginning of the Bible, meet a lot with people under a tree.
What?
I mean, Deborah was under the tree, judging under the palm of Deborah. The Lord, the Spirit was moving with her there. She comes, the Lord comes under the tree near Gideon's home, and he meets with Gideon there under the tree, right? Abraham is met by the strangers under the tree at Mamre, I think, right? It's just, oh man, I got a feeling we should be having our private times out under trees. I'm just kidding. What's that?
Wasn't Jonah also?
Jonah at the end was under the bush complaining to the Lord. Elijah, when he was running from Jezebel, lays down under a tree. The angel comes and talks to him there. I'm like, Ironically, though, somebody in my class connected that to say, it's interesting that all these things happen under a tree, but then the greatest deliverer comes on the tree. And I was like, it's a pretty neat connection. I don't know if I could build a ton of theological strings out of that, but it's a neat connection.
Well, that's what I was thinking when you were talking about it.
It's pretty cool. Pastor Ray said, or Kame, one of the two online says, Jesus was being tempted too, and the children, the children of Israel actually did do a disobedient thing to see what God would do, whereas the others are asking for a sign to help them decide to do what God wants them to do.
Jesus saw Nathaniel under a tree.
Oh, it won't scroll anymore.
Zacchaeus was in a tree.
So. So there's some interesting things, like these themes, right? These are type themes, right? And they create this thread of connection throughout the Word, which is why we read the whole Bible, by the way. If anybody tells you we don't read the Old Testament, and they're a preacher of a church, you need to be very wary of listening, because all of the theology of the New Testament and the apostles is founded upon the theology of the Old Testament. You cannot do away with that. It all points to the redemptive plan of God fulfilled through Christ. You cannot just separate that out. So it's beautiful when you start to connect these things and see them in a literary scope.
The New Testament, I mean, like, he prophesies about Jesus' death in the Old Testament, and in the New Testament, he died. I mean, the very thing that he prophesied. You gotta read the whole Bible.
Yeah, we do. We need it all. And to cap what Pastor Ray was saying, absolutely. So the people of Israel tested God in a way that exhibited a lack of faith. And here, these individuals are testing God in their faith for the purpose of obedience, right? So there is a little bit of a difference there in that. Okay? All right. Well, thanks everybody for coming out tonight. Thank you to everybody who joined with us online. We appreciate you being here, and we will see everybody on Sunday. Have a great week. So, let me ask you, if we keep it